All right, everybody. We are live, and today is going to be a debate between myself and Kelly. We're going to be talking about the Bible. Does the Bible explain existence or reality? You guys decide. Hopefully, we just bring in the best arguments from both sides. I'm going to be taking the position that the Bible is not the best way to describe reality. Kelly is a Christian. So that's what he's going to do. I'll let Kelly go ahead and introduce himself before I get into it. How's it going, man? How you been?
It's going well. I always enjoy chit chatting with you online. My name's Kelly in Washington State. So, yeah, I'll be bringing, I think, the Bible perspective as well as I can understand it this time and look forward to the chat.
Cool. Yeah, we'll try to make this about an hour, not much more than that, to respect everybody's time. But I'll go ahead and get into it so we can get this thing going. So, as I mentioned, um, I am taking the position that the Bible is not the best way to explain existence, and the reason why I would say that is first thing that comes to mind is this idea of contradictions. So for me, anything that's a contradiction cannot exist by definition. It's a contradiction. These things are not logically possible. So, what sort of contradictions am I going to point out about the Bible? Well, I can think of a whole bunch. Like right now, say that God is all loving and all powerful, and yet we see unnecessary suffering, unnecessary evil existing. So this is a contradiction. If God is all loving, that means everything that exists by his will should reflect that. So for me, that's kind of a problem. The Bible also says in was it Matthew 19, I think it's 25 or 26, it says that with God, all things are possible. That's what Jesus supposedly said, is that with God, all things are possible. Yet, like if you were to read like the story in Judges 1:19, it mentions that the Lord was with Judah, and he had drove out all the inhabitants of the mountains during this war, but could not drive out the inhabitants of the valley because they had chariots of iron. So that's sort of a contradiction to the statement that with God all things are possible. Well, that verse tells us that he could not drive out the enemies in the valley because they had chariots of iron. What, is God not able to defeat iron? I don't get it. Um, so we could get back to personal injury. Let's say the Bible would say like eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. Yet Jesus says in Matthew 5:39, ye resist no evil, but whoever smites you on the right cheek, turn the other also. So again, this is kind of a contradiction, a change in the overall message that doesn't really make a lot of sense. Um, I used to also be a Jehovah Witness back in the day, and those guys were really big on the end of the world type of teachings. So like when Jesus said, verily I say unto you, there will be some standing here which will not die until they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom. And yet, here we are 2,000 years later. Those guys are dead. I mean, when's the last time you heard what any of those guys had to say? What is he saying now? Right? He's got nothing to say because he's dead. Okay? Then we've got scientific reasons for why I reject the Bible as a good description of reality. For example, the order of the universe, does not, the way it's described in Genesis in both those two chapters where it reiterates the creation story, they don't line up with the story told by our latest scientific evidence. You know, we don't. There's a contradiction there. Order contradiction, or the order of creation just contradicts known science. The flood in Noah couldn't have happened as described. If you look at it as a literal global flood that covered the world's highest mountains, Well, I'm sorry, there's just not enough water on earth to do that, right? Even if the heavens opened up and all the water in the sky came down at once as rain, the planet would be submerged, but only to a depth of maybe an inch or two. And that's according to the U.S. Geological Survey when they spoke on this particular subject. That's not enough water to justify a canoe, let alone a massive ark, right? So we've got a bunch of contradictions in science. We could go over that. Bats aren't birds. Then we've got history, for example. So while some events in the Bible can be verified, Israel existed, Egypt, Rome, these things are verified as existing other facts. But historians generally do not consider the Bible as a historical reference text. Instead, they look for primary documents and archaeological evidence as better sources for history when they look for things rather than the Bible. I mean, why would they even need to search if the Bible were to explain everything like that? And then they found contradictions. The Exodus obviously never happened. Millions of people would have left traces of them being around. So, and then there's moral questions. It seems like moral progress in the world would say that slavery is bad. Yet, Ephesians 6:1, slaves, obey your earthly masters with respect and fear and with sincerity of heart, just as you would obey Christ. Obey them not only to win their favor when you're in their eye, but as slaves of Christ, doing the will of God from your heart. So obey these masters as if they were God. That doesn't resonate with my values or consistent with most civilized people's values. Slavery is not good. Now, my opponent may bring up like, well, this was indentured servitude with the Hebrews. That's okay. That's good slavery. Well, I don't think there's ever a good time to enslave someone. Maybe he'll say, well, slavery was kind of common in the ancient world. It was a way of helping people. If you defeated someone in war, where are these people going to go after you defeat their land? You kill their husbands. What do? You just going to leave them there to die? No, take them as your property, as slaves. You're doing them a favor, right? Well, Exodus 21, verses 20 through 21 tells us that, you can beat your slaves as long as they don't die after a few days. That's real nice. Then when you go into different countries to get your slaves, um, you know, kill the man, give the woman some time to mourn. I think it was 30 days. She was to shave her head, put on different clothes, certain special clothing. And for 30 days, she could mourn the death of her husband because, after all, you did kind of kill her husband in front of her and her kids. So, yeah, not so good. Give her some time to get over it. Then you can go ahead and marry her against her will. I'm sure she'll love you for that, right? So, there's just a lot of things. I don't want to take up too much time with my opening. We'll get into a lot more stuff. Um, but, anyways, I want to hand this over to Kelly and let him give his opening argument. So, go for it, my friend.
Well, thanks. That was a pretty good list there. Nice start. Um, there's one of the more popular authors that I've read among Christians called R.C. Sproul, and he has a lot of information to say. One thing is that he's looked at some atheists had come up with a list of 30 contradictions in the Bible. So he examined them all and found every one of them to be an incorrect understanding of the Bible. And they weren't actually contradictions. And so you can start off with there's some, the Bible's written in an interesting way. And one thing that God does is he acts like a loving, kind, nice father to his children. And so one thing he does is, like in Genesis at the beginning, Adam and Eve sinned and then they went and hid. And God says, "Where are you at? Where are you guys at?" Well, we've all seen parents who have done that. They know exactly what the children have done. or they've seen it, and the children are hiding, and they're kind of cajoling and teasing the situation. And so there, it looks, if you take the Bible literally, and this is a modern problem, and we'll get into this a lot because it gets into all sorts of things. Because I've looked at many perspectives on the Bible from a lot of Christian groups, and we're living in a time of mayhem. And this discussion here is actually pretty good, but a lot of things taken literally will make the Bible look ridiculous, but that's not the actual intent. One thing I've come to is that every part of the Bible is read in the way that you would kind of naturally read it. So if you're going through poetry, you take it as poetry. And if it looks like a historical narrative, that's what you look at. You look at it as a literal rendition of history. And there's commandments, and there's poetry, there's love stories, all sorts of things. One of the more interesting is prophecy and eschatology about later days. And that is where, boy, oh boy, the last 50 years has been crazy. With the nation of Israel coming back in 48, that's been a timeline that's caused a lot of people trouble. And then Hal Lindsey didn't help. He wrote a book, I think in the 70s, called The Late Great Planet Earth. And he was saying that the end of the earth is coming pretty soon. Well, that was widely believed, and he sold a lot of books and made a lot of money. And based on, if you looked at good theologians from the past, his arguments were just really poor. So the justice in the Bible, an eye for an eye, one thing about that is that's the value of a crime. If somebody commits a crime, you extract, if the perpetrator is caught, you extract eye for an eye. That is restoration. And that's a big theme in the Bible, and that has to do with slavery also. Is God is working towards restoring society and people. There's a lot of interesting things about dealing with crime or dealing with people, dealing with slaves, and people say that's terrible. Oh, I think I missed your point about God can do all things. God is healing all things. He does it at a pace we may not like, slow, and so it appears that nothing is getting done. Although history is moving forward slowly but surely, and it has a goal, and the scriptures give the best means to get there. The order, the creation order. Yeah, I thought this discussion might center a lot on what's the most probable reason for the existence. God creating everybody, or a big bang and then things evolve over time. So we'll probably get to that, but it's somewhat obvious when you look at the start of any new person's life. They're born from parents, and they're unaware of where they came from. And as they grow up, they become aware, and everybody tells them, well, on this date, you were born. Two people came together, and you were conceived, and then you were born. And we all believe that story because we see it quite often. A lot of these things are symbolic, and they're explained in the scripture. Like many years ago, I thought it was somebody pointed out that Adam and Eve were created in innocence, and they didn't know they were naked. Well, that's like the status of a child until they're about 5 years old. And this occurred for them for maybe a few days. But the reality we see all the time, childhood, is told in the scripture. And these things connect back and forth. The flood. Yeah, I read the world's record rainfall of one day anywhere on Earth in the last century, because I used to enjoy reading world record books. Somewhere I think the China Sea got 5 feet of rain in one day in one area, and that would have been horrific. I've heard of rainstorms like that, even on a smaller scale. Well, I thought, well, imagine the whole Earth with that much rain going for 40 days. You got 200 feet of water, and that would be a miracle in itself, but it still isn't anywhere near enough for the Bible flood. But now, the last Noah movie about 5 years ago with popular actor, his name is escaping me. It was pretty lame in many, many ways, but one thing it did show, I think, well, was how God prepared them to make the ark and also where the water came from. It's interesting. The Bible has a few verses that a lot of people don't notice. And it's easy to say that there was 40 days of rain and God flooded the earth. But the fact of the matter is there's a few verses that say God broke the well springs of the earth and the water came out of the earth and then it also rained. So in that movie, all of a sudden some guy's standing there on dry ground and the next second a big wave blasts him away to his oblivion. That's really what happened. And even to this day, scientists are just now finding enormous amounts of water in the earth, uh, which, if released quickly, would be troublesome. I think we have evidence that this actually happened at that time. I have some theories on this myself. Like the bottoms of the oceans are covered with trenches. There are grooves in the earth all over the place where the ocean might be 2 miles deep. The trench could be as much as 7 miles deep. And there's these cracks all over the earth. And if God had a lot of water under the earth, and then he cracked the earth, set all that water free while a rainstorm, that's where the water came from. And to this day, the evidence would be these trenches in the oceans. And so God did create a global flood. But once the water subsided, the movement of water creates the land to move up and down. And so what we see is the land rising up. There probably weren't high mountains before the flood. So for them to be covered is really not a big deal. But once the water subsides, the land rises. You'd have continents rising quickly. I think probably the most likely thing is rapid continental movement, like within a year or two, and mountain ranges created. So then we would have things like the Grand Canyon, which is all this water heaped up on the North American continent. The land rises up and a huge puddle shoots out in one direction and creates the Grand Canyon in very quick time. We see this nowadays when volcanoes erupt or outbursts of glacial melt or something, where an enormous trench can be cut in a quick amount of time. And that's kind of why there's a lot of controversy between one group and another scientifically, whether or not some catastrophe changed the earth quickly. And other people say, well, it happened over millions of years due to erosion or whatever. Now, loving the wife, the slave wife. It's actually a pet idea I have because I studied these laws many years ago. It is very interesting. Like in the movie The Last Samurai, this American goes to Japan and kills a woman's husband. And by the end of the movie, they're in love and she marries him. What a happy story. The interesting thing there is there's a law where in the Bible where they can go to war and they're generally supposed to save the virgin women if the other people are maybe taken out. And you can marry them, especially if you find one attractive. That sounds harsh nowadays, although I think modern dating practices with the internet dating has gotten just about that savage again. And the point that's easy to overlook is a man that actually wins the heart of a woman, especially in a nasty situation. After a war, she's lost her husband. I've noticed that in wars in recent years, the better nations treat each other's women better. Like in World War II and other world wars, I've read a lot of history where Americans, I would say, were generally the best nation in general. And if they were to sin or something with taking the opponent's women, most of it was somewhat like dating, except that we had all the money and we were winning. So with a little bit of food, you could win her. And American soldiers were known to sleep with other nations' women while they were over in Europe. But I've never heard of stories of rape or mass rape or rape and torture. Well, the Russians and the Germans were notorious for just taking a group of women and sometimes raping them to death. They were rotten nations, and they were judged and destroyed. And the U.S. came out of that wealthy and powerful because we were the good guys in that respect. And that's the one thing about the Bible is it has good guys and bad guys. In Old Testament Israel, whether you like it or not, was the good guys. They wrote the word. Ah, I think that's enough for now.
Okay, cool, awesome. You brought up quite a bit, and I guess I'll try to take things a little bit at a time. I was trying to take a few notes here. Um, so you had mentioned that some of the Bible you don't take literal. I think something like that.
Yeah.
What? Let me ask you this: how do you? What method do you use to distinguish between the literal parts, the historical parts, and the mythological parts, if you will?
Hmm. Well, I don't think there's any error or a mythology um, of a story that's got no meaning or truth. But the understanding of each part is the easiest way to explain it is your plain reading, especially if you happen to be a pretty well read person. And so maybe a few centuries ago, this was more common where people had read more books. But I've seen it take people decades to come to these different ways of reading. That I'm actually an engineer, and you arrive at truth sometimes incrementally. You get closer and closer. You come to understand something, and you test it out, and then you uh, reread it, and develop a system where it gets closer and closer to truth. Um, when I say literally, that's literally what I meant. Is a word for word use of the Bible is quite poor. It's childish, but it's becoming common, and that's why people who read eschatology, there's all sorts of theories nowadays that are outlandish, and then some of it's like the Song of Solomon is a love poet, a love poem, and you have to really dig deep, sometimes in the meanings of words to get what the author has to say. So repetitive reading, study, I think it does. The Bible does stand up to scrutiny with secular sources, and it does help just to uh,
So just to kind of
think.
understand, so your method is, I guess, from what I'm understanding, is you saying that if you're well read, someone who's well read, they'll be able to distinguish between genres. Like you mentioned, the Song of Solomon was a poetic genre, whereas obviously you think the creation story is history. How do you know that? Because let's take a look at this. Other cultures around the world at the same time usually described events that way, like they told stories, and they understood that these stories weren't literally true, but they kind of conveyed an understanding. It's kind of like if you go to a movie, and you watch a really good movie, and you come out of the movie, wow, I learned something about life from this movie. Maybe you watch Forrest Gump or something. and you're like, or you watch Star Wars or something, some genre, right? And you come out of there learning, oh, this taught me a moral lesson. This taught me some sort of thing. How do we know that that isn't just the way that the ancients told storytelling? That that's how they engaged in storytelling? Because most scholars will tell you that Genesis was written sort of like in the same fashion as the Mesopotamian flood myths, the creation myths of Mesopotamia, where you had almost similar stories, even in South America, you have stories of creation. Even in Africa, all over the world, they had very similar creation stories, very similar flood stories, um, and these were all different. You know, the stories were not literal, but we're gonna cherry pick the Bible as the one that's the true one, right? Or couldn't they all just be a moral tale? And, you know, because I mean, think about it. People in those days didn't have the same culture that we do today. They didn't put an emphasis on facts and figures and stats and the same sort of rigor that we have today when we look at history and stories that are told over time. It seems to me, from everything I've ever read, is that the Bible is more of a moral story in many cases rather than just a real retelling of history rigorously. It's kind of like the Romulus story in Rome. Yeah, maybe Romulus existed. Maybe you know all of these people, you know the territories, everything that was spoken of. But does that mean that Romulus was really the son of God and he died and came back to life and rose to heaven in front of everybody? And does that really mean that, or was that just a moral story? Because it seems like if that can happen there, couldn't it also happen in the cultures of the Bible, the people that wrote the Bible, the Jews?
Well, I think the tail of the tape on that will be uh, 10, 20,000 years from now. What society will rise to the top and what will just fall by the wayside? We've already seen 2,000 years of evidence of how things are going. It is true. A lot of ancient texts and stories are especially probably when they were told person to person, they've changed. They were just kind of a vague story to give a moralism or whatever. The Bible does claim to be different in this regard. There's a word in or a line used in the Bible in many places. It is, this happened, thus saith the Lord. That is especially when there's a prophet. And in the Old Testament, if a prophet said something like that and it didn't occur, he could incur the death penalty on himself. He has to be right. That phrase there is where God has said, "This is what I say," and it's different. This is a group of people claiming absolute truth and absolute knowledge where it's given, and it's a part of their civil code as to whether or not they're right or wrong. And we could get into more of this, but most of these prophecies actually occurred within the life of a man, so he could be punished. There's not that much uh, hundreds or thousands of years into the future. And that's something that's not very widely modern people know. There's a logical circle, and it's some guy pops up. He says, "I am God. I am all powerful. I always tell the truth, and this is my word, and I am loving." And within that circle, you can't break it. If he's always honest, says he's loving, says he's all powerful, then you have to believe him. The unfortunate problem with that is another guy can come along and he can say the same thing, and he can be a liar, and he's just making it up. And we, the people, do have to choose or see these two types of people saying similar things and who we're going to believe. But that's why actually the Bible gives all sorts of prophecies so that it can be proven in a reliable sense. But there is the internal morality of people and other things we have to give us a right or wrong sense. Um, Now, I've actually spent a lot of time thinking about creationism, and I've read a lot of books, and you will not find very much written nowadays about the first two chapters of Genesis on the creation of the universe. There's all sorts of theories. It took billions of years. It's out of order. All sorts of things. But as an engineer, I thought about it and came up with a few things on my own. If you were to build a one thing God does is He lovingly teaches people how to live. So one of the things in the Bible is it teaches for it's for little children, for people to learn how to live. And you look at, say, Western society, which is largely built on Protestant background, centuries ago, we have cities and infrastructure and factories and roads and bridges and laws about money and land ownership. And then if you look at a tribal society where they might not believe in God, they might believe in a great spirit, or that all people are part of God or nature is part of God, and they won't own land. They they don't they don't kill animals. They might worship animals, like some peoples in Asia worship cows and rats, and you got all these different beliefs, but it won't create a society with the same sort of prosperity prosperity leading. And so that's where a lot of the cultural conflict comes from, is coming from a Bible background versus what the people generations ago said.
So that seems to be creating reality in your culture based on a belief rather than the belief itself actually describing reality, right? As it is before we sort of interpret it, right? Like it's kind of post hoc. Like say, now you mentioned something with the prophecies, like the book of Daniel.
Yep.
There's parts of Daniel that that are obviously after the fact because they talk about a lot of structures and things that didn't exist at the time that it was supposedly written. And so this is sort of evidence that this guy is referring to things that have already happened, which is pretty commonplace not only in ancient Israelite culture but in other cultures too. Is that they would retell history as a prophecy. um, that isn't really describing reality. That's sort of like creating a narrative about things you observe in reality. So what concerns me, like with the Bible, if we're gonna if the topic is gonna be if the Bible does it really describe reality? Well, again, we can start from the beginning. In the beginning, God. Okay, and never a there's never a question about that statement. In the beginning, God. Okay. No one ever in the Bible says, well, and the reason we're saying this is because of the Kalam cosmological argument or the fine tuning or all of that stuff is post hoc. It all comes out
Yeah.
after philosophers and everything thought about this stuff and started growing up and really examining the text and trying to understand the philosophy behind it. What we see is a lot of assumptions there and a lot of storytelling to sort of post hoc rationalize how the universe came to be, how Israel came to be, why were we taken into captivity by the Babylonians, why are we, a lot of it had to do with just explaining and storytelling. And for me, that's signature ancient way of doing history. That's how they did history. That's how they did things. They told stories and they kind of just formed made up stuff. and formed their beliefs, or even Rome did it, with Romulus and other characters in Rome. So it's not very surprising to me. Whereas today we have a much more evolved sense of rigor. So when we want to know the truth about how the universe came to be, or then there's certain methods we have to employ so as to alleviate any sort of errors along the way. We're really big now, especially in the West. We're really big on being truthful, right? That wasn't always the case back then. Their truths, there were mythological truth. Like one thing I do agree with William Lane Craig about is he says, people are looking at the Bible all wrong. No, Genesis is true, but it's not true in the sense that you think it's true. It's not true in the Western sense, like the sense that, oh, there were literally two people in a garden and this and that and this and that. No, the truth is in the overall moral of the story and everything, and that's how William Lane Craig sort of interprets the Bible, because he agrees. He says, look, this is all post hoc stories to kind of explain how things are. Now, that kind of causes a problem with me if you are a Christian, because a Christian is going to look for Jesus as your savior. Savior from what? What are we saved from? Sin. Where did sin come from? Sin came from Adam and Eve. Well, if Adam and Eve were just mytho history, then you mean Jesus died for nothing over a myth? No, Jesus couldn't have done that. That would have been stupid. God
Yeah,
wouldn't sacrifice his own son because of a myth, right? So now we have more problems in my mind, just as a skeptic and as somebody who really wants to know what the truth is. Um, it seems to me that um, Jesus, I think, I think he existed, but if he did, I think he probably did, just like everybody else at the time, probably believed the creation story was literal. And this is going to be a problem because, as we said before, or as I said before, the order, the chronology, the order of how things, evolved and developed, doesn't match known science. And we have evidence to back all this stuff up now. Whereas in the Bible, we don't have evidence that, you know, um, before there was light, there were stars. And before there were stars, the earth was formed first. Like, that doesn't make a lot of sense with known science. Now, if you're a science denier and you kind of look at like science as just a human project that inherits all the human limitations and bias that humans actually have, unfortunately, then I can kind of understand. But if you're someone who does believe in science, then I'm not sure how you're going to reconcile those two things. Are you a science person? Like, do you think
yeah.
science is the devil? Like, and I don't mean this funny. I actually
I don't
spoke to somebody not long ago who said science is of the devil. Point. End
know.
of story.
Yeah, there's people like that, the snake handlers.
Yeah.
No, I'm actually engineer, scientist, and studied math and a lot of topics. So I've meshed things together over the years. One thing that's kind of interesting is um, I don't have a Bible near me right now, but the sun or the earth was not made before. The phrasing in the creation is this was done in a day and in a day and a night, and then the next thing was made. Well, so there's a day listed before there was a sun or an earth. So how is there such a thing as a day and a night without earth and sun? This is a very interesting thing that a lot of people don't overlook is that all reality is what's in the mind of God, and the concept of everything is from the mind of God. A day and a night are are real events, real things, and they have different flavors. This was all designed, and we experience it because we happen to be on a planet that rotates and it revolves around the sun. But those things existed before they were physically made, and all sorts of reality existed before it was ever produced. And so God can describe things that would happen later. He says, well, this is a day and a night, and in 3 days I'm going to build the earth.
That's interesting. Is there any scriptural basis for that?
That is sort of a rare view nowadays. So I think I've read that in some books, but it is a kind
See,
of a
this is
hybrid idea.
the weird thing for me is that it seems like when we talk about apologists, like I think I heard one apologist, Frank Turek, who said
Who
that you
what?
can't. Frank Turek, I think, is the apologist who said this,
I've heard
Christian
that name.
apologist. Yeah, and I think his view was that the problem is people just read the Bible willy nilly. So what happens is you go in a hotel, you open up your Gideon's Bible, you read it, and you think you're reading the truth. And what his argument was is like, no, you have to also listen to the philosophies and the philosophers that can sit down and actually put this stuff together for you. Because if you just read it willy nilly, you're just going to get the wrong idea. You can't just read the Bible and expect to understand it. This stuff was written thousands and thousands of years ago by cultures that are so far removed from the consciousness of humanity right now. There's no way you're going to understand what was actually meant in its fullness. So that's where philosophers and apologists have done great work over the thousands of years to actually break this stuff down. So, but my problem with that is that, why does God make it so hard? Like here we have a Bible he produced in order to convey a very important message about himself and the way to be saved. And yet we need like to have when we go in a hotel, we can't just have the Gideon's Bible. We're going to have stacks of philosophy books now along with it to kind of cross reference and understand like is this really, and then again the Bible itself says that man is sinful, man is imperfect, your understanding is not my understanding, um who knows the mind of God, blah blah blah. Yet we're supposed to rely on these humans to understand the Bible. But then it gets a little deeper for me because the Bible, admittedly by anybody, is going to tell you that the hand of man actually put pen to parchment. That this was not, God didn't come down from heaven or an angel didn't come down from heaven with a supernatural pen and write stuff. No, it was sort of like dictation. Somebody was received this Holy Spirit or whatever it is, power from God, and he wrote down and dictated the thoughts of God. So he claims. The same guy that also wrote in that book, man lied, who, God doesn't lie, consider all men a liar.
Yeah.
Same people that write stuff like that are telling you to believe, oh, but I'm different. Believe me when I say I'm writing from the word of God. I guess my problem is a little credulity issue here, not just because I just dismiss it out of hand, because like I said, I used to be a Christian for a very, very long time, studied different Christian religions. But what I've come to understand is epistemology and how we come to know things. So, like, if these Bible writers will tell you all scripture is God breathed or what have you, inspired by God, well, why should I trust you? You admit that all men lie, and you admit that all men are fallen from the glory of God. So if that's your attitude going in, why should I believe anything else that comes out of your mouth?
Yeah. Oh, by the way, if you want to go another 30 minutes, that'd be
Sure,
fine. I didn't
sure.
realize we had so much to talk about, but it, it's very interesting. You bring up some good points, And I was raised Catholic, and now basically I'm more Protestant, Calvinistic. And what the Protestants did is they said, hey, the public should read the Bible. Everybody should. And the Pope said no for a while. And they had wars.
Yeah.
And I'm sympathetic to when I started reading the Bible and saying everybody should. I still look at history and I do see the problems it has created where everybody interprets it on their own. And wars was literally results. And it's like, oh man. And I look at Martin Luther as it looks like a hero for a while, and then the results of some of his stuff is horrific. And it's like, the interesting thing is that God has guaranteed the end results, and whether we like
And
it or
how do you
not,
know how do you know this? Like, that's a good statement you just made. God
yeah,
has guaranteed something. Okay. How
right.
do you know? Because it was it do you believe it because it was written in the book, the same book that
Well,
claims that it's true? So like the Bible's true, it even says so right there in the Bible. Therefore, the Bible's true. That it seems a little circular. But go ahead and tell me, how do you know
right.
this?
Well, it's kind of said in a few places, but I think prophet, maybe Isaiah, said something to the effect of, "My word will go out and it will accomplish all that I want it to." And it is what it is. It's like rain comes to the earth and it could grow crops or it could create a flood and wipe out people's houses. We don't really know what the results of rain is going to be, but it does what it's sent for. And if the Bible gives that guarantee, we all we can really do is relax. Because I've thought about it and I've hated and really disliked some of the results of history, but we still don't get to choose these matters ourselves. Um, I'll bring up one thing about interpreting scripture that might help you, and it's a very popular thought nowadays. That, like I said, Israel was rebuilt as a nation in 48, and Jesus said that this generation will not see me before I come in my kingdom, and this temple is going to be destroyed in this generation. So a
Mhm.
lot of modern people, led by the popularity of Hal Lindsey, have said, wow, within 40 years or 70 years of 48, something great's going to happen. So around the late 80s, people are going crazy, all sorts of books written. And then you study further and you find out that a lot of eschatology has this amazing symbolism. Jesus, you still there? Jesus was talking about a temple and it would be destroyed in a generation. Well, about 35 years later, there was actually a 3.5 year war in Jerusalem, and the Romans sieged the city, they destroyed the city and that temple. So the word was given 35 years ahead of time, and it occurred. But a lot of people don't like the results of that, and they think it has a modern application. But the fact of the matter is that his kingdom began with his ascension a long time ago, and it's just kind of steadily and slowly growing. People want an easy solution, a military solution, Jesus to come back and clean up the earth, but it's a slow growing process, like a seed grown in the earth. And so the understanding is just now kind of going back very slowly to the the kingdom of Christ, the church, slow growth, live a reasonable life. And there's not many military quick solutions to problems on earth, and that's kind of what a lot of people like. And World War I and World War II really changed Christians' interpretations, which is not a good way to interpret things based on history. Your picture has disappeared for the last minute or two, so wondering if you're still there. Hmm. I will see what this dinging on the phone is. Scientific truth. You brought up scientific truth and how moderns are kind of evolving to better understandings, and that's somewhat true. We It would be nice also if people are really open minded. For instance, so we just launched up the James Webb Telescope a year ago, which can see into the past or the furthest galaxies better than in the past. And I've watched with a lot of uh, kind of curious laughter about how astronomers nowadays are trying to interpret the new data that the James Webb is providing. If that well-developed galaxies are existing further and further away or back in time, and it's
Yeah.
the old dating of the Big Bang is now just almost totally exploded.
Yeah, I thought that was the case. I had to go back and research because I was actually discussing this with a cosmologist the other day,
Mm,
who I know. His name is Ethan. He does a lot of YouTube channels and stuff, and he's like a professor and teaches and stuff like that. And I had mentioned that, like the James Webb Telescope seems to be contradicting the standard model. And what do you think about that? What are your thoughts? And from what he said, he directed me to a whole bunch of paper. He said basically what's going on is there were some it's basically a resolution issue with the telescope. So there's
mm,
some sort of technical issue that if you there's other science, other math that if you actually apply it, you would expect the James Webb telescope looking at these particulars that they would actually indicate a longer universe, an older universe. But this is just a side effect. It's kind of like a what did he say? It was kind of like a it's a property of that issue. So it's
mm.
not that it's not overturned yet. It's just pop science clickbait stuff.
Yeah, yeah. There's plenty
That
of
they
that.
put out there. So you can't really. So I yeah, and I said I just saw it so many times. I just assumed that was what was really going on now. And he's like, no, 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 no. That's clickbait. It's not real. It's fake news. Um, don't trust it. There's a lot. We have a lot of evidence for the Big Bang in the form of cosmic background radiation, um, redshift. All those things still hold up. Now there are a lot of questions, and there are adjustments. And believe me, I'm open to as a person who's fascinated with stuff like that. I really wish that it was older than. I wish that I wish all of this stuff could get overturned just for my own entertainment. Like I would
Yeah,
love to see, like for me, I would love to see. Oh, actually, as it turns out, the Bible's actually true. I would love to see stuff like that happen because that's
mhm,
my personality. I'm wired up that way. I love to see the overturning. I love to see the apple cart get turned over with new information and new data and things. I love to see those little smirky smiles of the atheists go down and suffer. I would love to see it, believe me. And I'm an
mhm.
atheist myself, so I would love to be one of them that was, could just be get my smirk wiped off my face. I would love it because I want that. I
The
want,
truth.
but see, the thing is, when you're really after truth, you have to put those sort of wants and desires and biases aside and just be objective. So as far as where I am right now, just to kind of let you guys know and the audience know, is that I don't have a problem with the word God. I don't have a problem with God exists. I don't have a problem with any of that. Right now, I do have a problem with contradictions. I don't see how contradictions can actually exist. um, I have to stay. If you have to stand for something, if you're going to stand for something that makes sense, man. Stand for logic, things that make sense. And unfortunately, a lot of the everything I've ever heard to endorse the Bible or the Quran or any of these things really falls short. And I've studied it for years. Believe me, I was a baptized Christian. I
Ah,
was a preacher, teacher.
mm,
Um, Taught youth services, the youth, you know, um, kids at my church. Then I became a Jehovah Witness. I did the same thing there. I became really high in the organization. It took a lot for me to get out of Christianity. Don't let that fool you. Like, you could sit here and listen to me and think, "Oh, this guy is just a damn skeptic to the bone or whatever." But believe me,
Yeah.
this was a journey. This didn't happen just because I want to sin or whatever the
Yeah.
case that we like to say. This came through a lot of blood, sweat, and tears of having to really let go of some things that I really had no plan or desire to do. But that was years ago. And so
Yeah.
now I'm kind of comfortable in my skin to say, if I'm not convinced, I'm not convinced. And it seems like these sort of things just aren't moving me one way or the other. But that's a whole nother story. Don't base your beliefs
Well,
on that.
I
That's just me.
appreciate you. You got good questions.
Yeah, they're just questions. And another thing is the way that I am. I don't really I don't like this whole feel sorryism stuff in our society. I don't like this whole, oh, it's not politically correct. Oh, it hurts my feelings. Oh, I have to have a safe space to talk about it
True.
with people. You know
True.
what I mean? It's like,
Yeah.
if it's true, it doesn't matter how rigorous the questions are. It doesn't matter how rude your interlocutor is. If you if you have the truth and you're confident in your person, a narcissist or somebody like that is of no relevance. Like, just refute me with the facts. Let's bring the facts and let's put them on the table. And that's just where I'm at. So I don't. And another thing, I don't have a problem with people being religious or Christian. So don't feel like I'm out here to try to deconvert people. I'm not. I just like to have these conversations. I like the spirit of it. I like the passion. I like to get with someone who believes
Yeah.
something different than me, and then we can sort of work it out and kind of test it and challenge it a little bit, in all due respect, and
Yeah.
without hurting people. I'm not a rude person. I wish I
Yeah.
was a little more rude. I'd probably get a lot more views that way, but I'm just not that person. I just can't
Yeah.
do it. But anyways, that's pretty much where I'm falling on that. I still want to ask you a question before you go. I know it's getting close, but
I think I said I'd go another half hour if you want.
another half hour. Okay, cool. Um, the other question is, how do you resolve the problem of evil? Are you familiar with that
Yeah. Yeah.
philosophical issue? Okay.
Yep. Well, to state it, you said that at the beginning. God made it. God makes everything good. He's all good, love, all powerful, and made man good. So then, what happened? Um, One theologian, might have been Sproul again, said that man was created with the possibility of sin, and it was actually pre-planned for. The future is all known, but man did sin and fell. So now we have the problem of all powerful God who loves us. Why is there evil, or why is there so much, and why is it so personal? Um, I think it might have came from Calvin, who said that God can use evil for good, and He doesn't cause it, He doesn't condone it, but if it happens, He's got a plan for it. I look at the things. I'm very interested in military and political history, and World War II is I find one of the most fascinating. But most people think, it seems to me, that there's this evil Nazi empire, and they went out and they killed all these innocents. And we talk about that all the time. But I always thought that the Russian Empire was just as bad, and they both were envious of each other, and they hated each other, the Germans and the Russians in particular, and they both took Poland, and they were nasty. And they had an agreement. They had a document that said they wouldn't attack each other. And so Stalin and Hitler, they just were two happy campers until one said, nah, I think I'm going to take those guys. So then Germany attacks Russia. And we all mostly know the results of that. It was the worst part of the war, the most horrific. And if you think that there was innocent people that were, or an innocent side, that's not really historically accurate. Is God took one bad leader, turned him against another, regardless of how we feel about it. And most of the United States was well protected. We actually, the Russians to this day complain that the U.S. didn't do much against Germany. And a lot of people, oh, I can't believe they say that. Well, it's kind of statistically true that the Russians probably carried 70, 80, 90% of the weight. But that was just their lot. That was just the way it was. And the leadership of communism is just as bad as Nazism. So they turned against each other, they fought each other, and the US came out of it with a relatively light fight. And that's something that most people don't even understand because our history is pretty pretty moderate, I must say, the last few decades.
Yeah.
That's just
Uh,
one example, and that may not be a perfect example.
well, it
And
it it
there's
kind of
plenty that
it makes
upsets us,
sense.
especially when we see what appears to be innocent people suffering. And
Yeah,
that is
it
worth considering.
and it makes sense that the struggles happen and that good should fight evil, and really you need to have that dichotomy, in order to be good. You're going to have something to reference it by. Like, you can't really say I'm a good person if there's no good to be done. Like, if there's no evil to overcome, then how have you actually done anything good? Anybody can be good in that case. You're just good by fiat, which wouldn't make a whole lot of sense. So I understand you've got to have, the dichotomy there, and this works well under a naturalistic view, or a sort of a kind of pantheistic sort of view. I can see that making a lot more sense than, say, like in a certain, Christian interpretation, because if you're defining God as all good and all powerful, then you're getting rid of that possibility in that case. Because in my mind, the word all, like, I take the words very seriously to understand them. Like, if you're going to say, hey, I'm in all blue today, and you see red shoes and, purple socks and all
Not
that,
all.
then I'm not all blue, am I? Then there has to be
Yeah.
a mistake in that description. So if you're going to say God is all good, and yet out of his creation comes, the sin, the possibility of hell. In fact, the Bible says most people are going to go to hell. So it seems, in a way, and this is another thing I always, you know think is pretty laughable, is that, people are always like, well, you know abortion is wrong, or, you shouldn't murder people, this and that, or, you know people should maybe multiply and be fruitful. Well, that was seems to be unethical at this point, because if you know that most people, according to God himself, are going to go to the bad place, then why in the world would you take a chance and have a bunch of kids when you know that probably most of them, statistically speaking, are going to end up suffering forever? It's kind of like, if I knew, if I had like this omniscience, right? And I knew that if me and my wife are going to have a kid tonight, we're going to make a kid tonight, and that kid is going to grow up with Harlequin's disease, where his skin is inside out, his nerves are right there in the air, and he's just in insufferable pain. And I knew, and with my omniscience, this kid is going to suffer and cry from the time he's born till he dies around the age of 4 or 5, which they
It's
usually
terrible.
do. That's a
Ah,
terrible thing. And then I would, and I'm sorry, I would say, don't create. Don't create the kid, because if you create the kid, you're creating consciousness, and you're creating a consciousness that's suffering. And so my ethics would prevent me from wanting that outcome, right? But it seems that God, if he was omniscient and he knew that by creating, people were going to sin and he was going to have to throw them in hell because he's a just God, and making them burn forever in hell to make up for the 60, 70 years of sin that they've committed on the earth. If that's justice for God and he has to do it, then if I was God, I'd sit back and say, well, you know what? I'm not going to do that because that seems unethical. Why would I want to create that situation? And then it's not even their fault because they're born sinners. It's not like I chose to be born into sin. No, I inherited it, right? From Adam and Eve. But then, I understand the scapegoat clause. Well, that's why he brought Jesus and this and that. Yeah, but people are still going to reject Jesus, and they're still going to burn in hell. And I know 100% it's because some people are just not convinced that that's the case, that that's true. So you mean to tell me that a person who accepts Christ on their deathbed after raping and killing children, he's going to be saved because, Jesus didn't die for nothing. You know, what God did for us, no sin can overcome that, right? That's the story, right?
Yeah.
So if that's true, then what that's pretty much saying is that me as just a guy who's going through life, maybe I'm just a dumbass and I can't see it. And I'm like, I'm sorry, I just can't get with it. I can't sincerely say I believe in Jesus and all of that. And okay, so I go to hell forever and ever for that. Yet this guy that raped and pillaged and killed all these people, he goes to heaven because he sincerely turned himself to Christ. That's not, something's wrong about that. And that's really consistent with the scripture I pulled up here, the Isaiah 45:7. I form the light and create the darkness. I make peace and create evil. I, the Lord, do all these things. So God can't be all good if he himself is telling us that I create evil. So there's a contradiction there somewhere, and I don't
Yeah.
know. This whole thing is just confusing to me
Yeah.
and a whole lot of people. And I understand that
Yeah.
apologists have a lot of mental gymnastics that we can all participate in, but I'm
Yeah.
not sure if that's really convincing. I don't know. What do you think?
Well, your concept of the deathbed confession is a common one, and it's not really quite that way. It's a person that actually repents, and that's way different than just some mouthing of words. The guy on the cross next to Jesus was an example, but I think I got two stories that'll be comforting. I've said a lot of things that make it sound like a lot of people nowadays are confused or wrong, and I'm right. That's an unfortunate thing. I've given some things a lot of thought. Today, a few Protestants are coming to the eschatology of the Catholics, and that is that history, in my opinion, will go on for tens of thousands of years, maybe 100 thousands of generations, as the Bible puts it. And at the end of time, the the mass of humanity will be saved by and large. That the earth will be covered with the knowledge of the Bible, and that most people on earth, whatever the population is, it may be a lot more than now, will be all saved. And that means that Jesus is going to win, not through a military victory, but through love and growth, through throwing the seed on earth and growing the mustard tree.
Oh, you
So,
sound like a tree hugger now.
well,
I'm just kidding.
in the long run, it all works out well for most people, and so it's like most people are saved. I think there's a common idea nowadays that you've mentioned that's not the best way to look at the Bible again. Is some people say if somebody does some small sin, they got big problems coming from God. Well, that's really not the focus, and it's really hard to get off on this. Where God says, "I love the world so much, I did this or that." The story, if you look at it long term, is like the story of the Old Testament Israel. Is you got these people that were chosen by God, but they do bad, and they go worse and worse and worse, and then Israel gets worse than their neighbors, and their neighbors were just terrible, and they thought, well, how could this be? And God will, for decades and centuries, try to love and corral them. Now, on an individual basis, I mean, there's only a handful of people that have even thought about this, but if you look at the people that crucified Christ, you would think about the worst of the worst. Israel had gone downhill for 500 years, and now you have this priesthood that finds an innocent man, and they decide not only to kill him, but to kill him in the worst way they could think of. So, what does God do about that? He's loving, and yet they've done this terrible thing. Well, that's the real interesting thing is Jesus, when he was leaving Earth, the year 33 or whatever, said that in a generation, Jerusalem is going to be annihilated. So then he dies, and then the apostles preach there for 30, 40 years. And the message is love your neighbor, love God. And then there's a warning also given, prophecy, the Christians, when you see the city surrounded, get out of town, leave. And that's what happened historically is a lot of Christians left when they saw Rome entering. If you look at the timeline, you got some people. The Pharisees and the Sadducees were creating a new false religion. They were compiling the Talmud, which was made in the years 200 to 400 historically. But they were starting it. They were starting a new religion. They were taking Moses and discarding him. So for 500 years they declined. Then they crucified an innocent man, and then they had the chance to repent. They had 30 years, 35 years. God loving them, saying, "Hey, that was a bad thing. Should." Those who became Christians left town. Some of them sold their houses, made money, and gave it to the church. Those who didn't stayed in Jerusalem. Rome surrounded it, destroyed the temple, and it was a 3-year siege. And in those days, that was that's really kind of the hell that the Bible talks about is people who have long-term sin and obstinacy to the truth. They eventually will die a horrific thing. What's interesting is the revelation is these descriptions of like the lake of fire, and people think, well, that might be something out in space and eternity, but the fact of the matter is it was more likely a description of a typical burial scene of that day where they threw 100,000 corpses into a pile and set it on fire. And
Gehenna.
it's
Yeah.
it's yeah, modern people have almost no concept of these sorts of wars, and so all this history is largely lost. But God loves the people that crucified Jesus and gave him decades. But there's always an end, and it also explains why when Peter preached, he said, "You're the ones that crucified the Christ." A lot of people say, "Oh, well, that applies to everybody." Well, it applied to them directly. Peter was not joking; he was just telling a plain fact when he first preached about a couple months after the crucifixion in the
Hmm.
same city.
Well, it's that kind of little side note comes up when I think
Yeah,
about that is
it helps, but it is
yeah, it's
related.
there's something about that sort of logic, and this goes back to ancient times where if a nation does you wrong, right, to another nation or to another religious organization or whatever the case may be, a tribe, say, um, it's always God's gonna punish everybody that's part of that
Yeah,
offending nation. It's kind of like we're looking at the Israel Palestinian situation
yeah,
going on now, and so people are like,
ugly.
Hamas is terrorists because hey, they're killing innocent people because of their gripes with Israel and land and real estate. Well, I mean, this is kind of consistent with biblical logic if you think about it. I mean, when God went to punish the Amalekites, he didn't punish just the leaders. No, he killed the infants and the children and the women could be raped and if you liked them and at least the ones that have never known a man, meaning a virgin.
Yeah,
Um and so that sort, if it's suppose CNN was around back then, they'd be like, "Hey, you can't do that. That's a humanitarian crisis over there. You can't go and kill infants." I mean, that's what they were blaming Hamas for when they were condemning Hamas or Palestinians. Oh, they're killing Israeli babies. You can't do that. Well, their own Bible says they can do it. It's in their history, right? So I'm not agreeing with it. I think it's all terrible. I'm not for Palestine. I'm not for any of
Yeah,
that. You know, I'm not
yeah, I
saying that,
understand.
but you know what I
Yeah,
mean. It's like let's the consistency is what I'm looking at here,
yeah,
and
yeah.
you know,
It's hard to say that one side is good, the other one's bad, especially based on religion. And nowadays, I'm not sure if that's even
yeah,
true at all. And I have a grudge going against the Russians and the church for blessing that war.
hmm.
And I got Ukrainian roots. I don't know if
Oh,
that's
I didn't
part of
know
it,
that.
but I understand your point, and I don't really want a 10-hour explanation of it.
Yeah, yeah,
But
yeah, yeah.
you're largely right, and
I mean, they're just I'm not like these aren't like really. I'm sure some apologists probably thought all this stuff through, and he's
yeah,
probably got all kinds of
a fat
logical
theological
arguments to yeah, it's
theological book.
theological points that can well, it seems that way at face value, but if you really dig in, and you think
Yeah,
about it.
yeah,
But I guess I just don't trust philosophy, number one. I don't really trust it because I think it's a very human endeavor, like anything else, but it's not even based on like at least with the scientific method. I think science is one of the better human projects we've undertaken because it kind of like is an attempt to take the bias out rather than put it in. Like we're trying to say in science, we're trying to come up with a methodology that's objective and yet science
yeah,
has a lot of problems. I mean,
yeah,
science only measures behavior. And so a lot of people will conflate, especially a lot of atheists will conflate behavior with ontology, and they'll say, "Oh, science has disproven God. Science has done this, and it's said this about religion." Science has said no such thing, because science has nothing to do with that. All it's about is measuring, you know, um, causation. That's all it is. It's all about causation and correlations. That's all it
mhm,
is. And
yeah,
that's external stuff. That's not the internal stuff. So that aside, I think that's the best we can do for right now is just let's focus in on external causation. Let's measure, let's make a prediction. You know, this is what I want to say about the Bible. Like, it would be great if, a religion or a claim, you could make a testable prediction and then repeat it and verify it. Then we would have a better grounding to say this is probably true. Like let's say, and I get a lot of kickback from this. This is what I don't understand with a lot of certain Muslims and Christians ask me this. Well, what is it going to ever take for you to believe? You know, what is it going to take for you to understand? Jesus is true or Allah is true. And I'm like, well, look, I
yeah,
always tell them like this. Look, if Allah is true, if I was to pray to Allah and say every day at 5:01 and 30 seconds that you would carve my name into my tree in my backyard for the next 4 days and I could videotape it and have other people witness it, and so it's not just me, that would be convincing evidence and I would totally become a Muslim at that point, right? That seems fair to me, but to them it's like, oh,
ridiculous.
you're asking God to be he's not like that. You can't just pull he's not a genie. He's not somebody. It's okay. Well, then why did you ask me? You know, what should I be at looking for then? What you look
Yeah,
for? It's like,
yeah,
come on, man. I'm not you. Like I have a different standard of evidence. Mine is pretty high because I'm after truth. So the deeper the claim, the higher the standard should be. Like if someone's to say, "Hey, I walked a dog yesterday. Do you believe me? You didn't see it. Do you believe me or do you just believe me on faith?" And I'd say, "I
yeah,
believe you on faith because the reason why I'm willing to do that is because number one, I've seen dogs before. I've walked dogs before. I see people walking dogs every day. So it's no big fucking surprise that you say it's true that you walked your dog yesterday, right? But if you were to
Yeah.
tell me, "Oh, my grandma was dead for the last week, but guess what? She bubbled up from the grave and came to life after we prayed." Would you believe me then? You believe the dog story, why not that story? Well, duh, you know, like that's a miraculous story. That's an extraordinary claim. So I would need evidence that would be commensurate with that claim. Dogs don't fall into that category. Resurrections do. Your God does. These are claims that are very specific and very extraordinary in their nature, and by definition, for example, that's why they're called miracles. Not because they happen every day and anybody can believe them. They're called miracles because they're really fucking hard to believe, and
Yeah.
it happened anyways. So miracle, and that's proof. And yes, I agree. If I saw a miracle, if I was to go to my church tomorrow, and some guy was to get his head cut off, and and come back to life, put his head back on, and walk out of the church, that would be pretty amazing.
Yes.
you know.
Yeah.
So I mean, that's kind of where I'm coming from. But
Yeah.
look, we're kind of running out of time. I've got another guest coming on here in about 30 minutes, so
Yeah.
I'm gonna have to cut it down. But hey, I really appreciate you, Kelly, for coming on. I'm glad to have met you because we've
Yeah.
had interactions back and forth sometimes, and it's always good to have
Yeah.
the face and the person whom you're talking to. It makes a big difference.
Yeah. Yeah. I enjoyed this. Nice meeting you, and it was a good time. Um,
Cool.
I think I could maybe somewhat quickly reply to the last few
Yeah.
things you said.
Sure. Go right ahead. Have the
Um,
last word, please.
uh, it's the miracles in the Bible are kind of interesting when you think about them. God doesn't do magic shows and poof up a dragon or something. All of them are very strange in that they're just like reality on a fast time scale. It's that your body heals all the time. You get injured, you get healed. But if you get healed in an instant, that's a miracle. Or if water turns to wine instantly, it normally takes weeks or months in a factory, or all these things. So it's these are well, resurrection from the dead is maybe a different category even.
There's two miracles I do believe in, by the way, but go right ahead.
Uh, okay. Um, I, if we're going to be philosophical, I'm not going to say that accept God because of this or that. But if you look at science and where it came from a creationist model, we say an intelligent God created the universe and he created people to be intelligent. And so science is a natural outflow. And I think that historically the West has shown to be more scientific than other religions. And as one example, I hold a grudge against the Catholic Church fighting Galileo on this matter. That's one example. But if you think about the universe as evolving from a random process, well, then science becomes either something you can't study or is unreliable. And there's a philosophy. It's kind of unpleasant, but if you deny God, you, in a sense, deny your ability to understand things, and so it leads to a random future. And I think this also historically bears out. Like the West is turning away from Christianity, and societal problems are cropping up where we don't have the order we used to have. But I'm glad that we're all able to think and talk it over.
Yeah, that's what we're here for, man. And the two miracles that I'll grant is that, something exists rather than nothing. There's no explanation for it. So that's a miracle by definition. It's magic. There's no cause. You can't trace the cause. So that's a
Yeah,
miracle. The other thing is that life exists on this planet. I think that's a miracle because again, we don't know what the causes are. We don't understand those questions. No causes we can trace, kind of like magic tricks. Um, that kind of fits the definition of a good miracle for me, and I'm more than willing to grant them in the absence of evidence. But when good evidence comes along to explain why something exists rather than nothing and why life exists on the planet, which I'm not sure how they're going to figure that out, but if they ever did, hypothetically, I'd gladly grant that. I just go along with whatever the evidence is, and I'm not going to just put my head in the sand when I see a miracle right in front of me. Am I going to just act like it ain't there? No, it's there. We exist, and you can't understand why. So let's get real with it. So I grant you those things, and I think there we can make a little good compromise, if you will.
Yeah, those are impressive things.
Very, very.
Here, here,
There,
here we are.
here we are, and I mean, they could be, so many explanations and models for it, and but no one really knows. So glad to grant that. And anyways, my friend, it's 1:30. I'm gonna go ahead and get off here now. I appreciate you again, Kelly, for coming through, man, and look
Yep.
forward to more lively little debates on Fight on the Fence. And
Yeah. I hope
yeah,
billions of people get to see this.
yeah, the algorithm's gonna kick in, and they'll probably see it on review. It's kind of last minute, so I couldn't really blast it like I wanted to, but
Ah,
someone will see it. The channel will grow, and we'll start showing people that we can have
yep,
great discussions,
yep, yep,
regardless. So
yep. It went in more directions than I had thought, but it turned out well. So that's good.
yeah, yeah, absolutely, man. All right, brother, I'm gonna let you go. Have a great day, Kelly. Audience, we'll see you in about 30 minutes. And I'm going to be actually, if you want to watch the video later, I'm going to be interviewing a Christian again, but he's going to be talking about church hurt. He's a gay person who's had some hate from his church and he wants to air it out and
Ah,
kind of get to the bottom of it. And I'm not going to try to talk bad about Christianity in that case. I'm just going to let him, you know.
all right.
Yep. So, anyways, my friend, we will see you on the rebound.
That is true. Look forward to seeing you again.
You got it, guy.
Have a
See you
fine
then,
day.
man. You too.